So at this time of year, we're treated to a first-class football betting opportunity. And it all comes around because of the amount of money that's involved in football, the incentive to play your best players or navigate a tricky fixture list and so on. But it always provides a great start to the year if you're into any sort of football betting or trading. So what is that opportunity? How can we exploit it? And what are some examples of this that have occurred in the past? Let me show you all of that in this video. So this is a football betting strategy that you can deploy throughout the year, but it does have its peaks and troughs. And one of the biggest peaks that you'll see with this particular strategy is the FA Cup. But when we reach the third round of the FA Cup, this is where the old romance of the FA Cup comes into the mix again. But the reality is a lot of the romance of the FA Cup has gone nowadays, simply because the gulf in quality between these two teams is going to be absolutely huge now. However, that does bring in a few opportunities into the mix as well, because when we look at the FA Cup as a competition, or indeed the Football League Cup, but we'll focus on the FA Cup on this video, you look at the prize money that's available for the FA Cup. And when we go from the early rounds into the later rounds, one of the things that you'll notice is that for a non-league team or a smaller team, the prize money could be quite substantial. But when we look at the Premier League, the rights for the Premier League get sold for many billions now. And part of that deal is that the money gets divided up equally amongst all of the teams within the Premier League. So when you look at the amount of money that's in the Premier League and you look at the rewards for performing well in the Premier League, the FA Cup sort of dwindles in significance substantially. And as a consequence, the romance of the FA Cup, that, feeling that you used to get with the FA Cup is really on its way out, simply because the FA Cup cannot compete in terms of prize money. And therefore, a lot of the focus of those bigger teams really is on the Premier League and also European Cup competition, which is rewarded even bigger in terms of the amount per match than you would get on a Premier League match. So Premier League, European football, that's where all of the money is. The FA Cup and the Football League Cup, there's really not an awful lot of money there, although it would be nice to win a trophy. You're not going to risk your best striker or your best team on some godforsaken pitch in the middle of nowhere in bad weather conditions with a team that's going to probably rough you up a bit because they don't have quite the quality. You're just not going to play your best players there. You're going to focus all of that attention on to those big matches. But that's fundamentally where the opportunity comes from, because we know that it's unlikely, especially if you've got a big Premier League team playing a minnow, that they're going to play their full strength team. They will rest players and things like that. And that's where some of the opportunity can come into it. But also, not all Premier League teams are performing at their best. So that presents an opportunity as well. So let's explore what those opportunities are. So one thing to look from a football betting perspective is for those shocks. And the interesting thing about shocks is that very often they don't look that shocking. If you're into your betting and you know what the odds are on certain matches, you tend to look at some of the things that are described as shocks, and they don't tend to be that shocking, really. Sometimes you see teams winning that went off at odds of 6-1 or whatever. And if you're looking at decimal odds of 6, that means that the team has about a 17% chance of winning that match. So, it's not unsurprising that if you've got loads and loads of matches all next to each other, that one or two of those could end up being a win against the odds, but it's not going to be significantly against the odd. I would call a shock something that's like 50 or 60-1, something, a real rank outsider that gets a result against a much higher level team. That's shocking, but something at 6s or 7s isn't that shocking, really. You expect it to occur on a semi-regular basis, and especially when there are a billion matches all going off at once, you're going to get a few thrown into the mix from there. However, when we look at lower league teams playing much bigger teams, you can sort of begin to identify areas where you could potentially find odds that are going to be within your favour, because a lot of the lower league teams aren't particularly well researched, and also those higher league teams probably would rest the odd player or two, even if they're at the bottom of the league, simply because they do want to try and preserve their league status. So when you're looking at teams that are in good form and are flying away at the top of their respective league, they feel that they can rest a few players and bring in some other players without too much risk. And the interesting thing is confidence. When I've studied and analysed sports in great depth and looked at all of the statistics, one of the things that comes across repeatedly is just how important confidence is, whether it's an individual player or a team. Because if you have a confident striker, when the ball comes across, they will just step up and blast it and it goes flying into the back of the net. But it's very easy to spot a striker that is low on confidence because the ball comes flying in, he'll take an extra touch and then the defender will get rid of it. So when you see teams that are low on confidence, that's where you sort of tend to find where a few shocks can occur. So it could be a team in a higher league that's on a bad run of form, somebody that's changed manager recently, or somebody that's stuck at the bottom of the division and they can't seem to score a goal for toffee. And that's the sort of areas that you need to examine. Teams that are low on confidence, that aren't on a particularly good run, but are playing a lower league team that are doing particularly well and are really up for it. That's been a very fertile sort of ground for me in previous FA Cups and previous cup competitions, because when you have a bit of confidence and you're on a bit of a run, then you stand a good chance of overturning some of those odds. And the FA Cup third round is one of those parts of a cup competition where that becomes much more likely. So where the biggest opportunity comes in the FA Cup third round, and indeed in most cup competitions, is on team news, because we know that those managers are going to protect their team and their star players, and they don't really want to put them out, if necessary, into a sort of a nothing cup match, especially where they're against a weaker team. Now, if they're slightly nervous, then they may put some of those players on the bench, but very often they will field a much weaker team altogether. So an hour and a quarter before the match, you will see the team sheet, and that will start to move the market, because it's critically important that anybody putting serious money down will wait until they see the team sheet. And when they see the team sheet, they will decide whether they want to back or lay a team, or which sort of team they choose to go for. But seeing the team sheet is what professional punters always look for. That's where the big money comes in, is as soon as everybody knows who is playing. And you can get pretty significant reactions on a cup match simply because a lot of players could be rested or even not appear on the squad list at all, not even on the substitute bench. But also there are other factors that play in. Every market, there's another level that you can go down into. And one of the things that I do is I'm always looking at players that are carrying a knock or are injured or are on the injury list. And that gives you a guidance as to what sort of players are likely to play, and if they choose to rest players, who those players are likely to be. Because if you have that information, that can sort of positively influence the price that you get on, or the chance of anticipating what that team sheet will be. And it can produce some absolutely spectacular opportunities. So rather than sort of just pluck these out of my head, let's have a look at some of the things that have occurred in previous years. So one year when Liverpool met Everton, Jurgen Klopp was very confident that Liverpool would win the match. So confident that he was talking down the team ahead of the actual competition itself. And you can see that reflected in the chart. That discounted and reflected the fact that Liverpool were going to field a weakened team. However, when the team news was announced, it was much, much weaker than people expected, and the chart absolutely flew off. So if you're alert to news flow ahead of these matches, that can give you a good indication as to what to do. But necessarily, when you see that team sheet, it can significantly influence the odds. So when you're actively trading team news, sometimes the team news can be significant around a certain player. So if there's a key player within the team, maybe they're particularly on form, or a key member of that particular team, that can significantly affect the outcome of the odds for that match, either ahead or actually when that team sheet is announced. And one year we had that situation with Leicester when there was a lot of doubt about whether Jamie Vardy would start the match or not. That led to a bit more interest within that particular match. And then when the team sheet was announced, he wasn't actually in it. And you can see the reaction that we had on the match odds for Leicester. So yeah, even if it's just down to an individual player, that can still have a significant impact on the odds that you're likely to see for any team in that match. So the sort of perfect example that you're looking for is a much higher team playing a lower team, preferably not too far away, but where there's a lot of fixture congestion and you get a number of injuries. And when you get that combination together, you can get some pretty spectacular situations occurring. So one of the best examples I can give you of that is when Liverpool played Exeter in the third round of the FA Cup. And the problem that Liverpool had is that they had a lot of fixtures that they were going to play, including in Europe. And they had picked up a large number of injuries. So it was quite likely that they weren't going to play their strongest team anyway in the FA Cup. But then in a couple of matches beforehand, there were some more injuries. And as a consequence, that when the market goes up, it represents and reflects the odds that you would expect at that moment in time. But as news starts to drip out about the likely team selection, fixtures, injuries and stuff like that, that begins to get discounted in the market. So you begin to see a bit of a drift occur within the market. And as we get closer and closer to that particular date, you may see some additional press that indicates what the manager's thinking, and then that will accelerate that drift. But of course, when the team sheet is announced, that's when you'll know exactly what the situation is. And you can see some spectacular results from that particular strategy if you're aware of the backgrounds to that particular match and what could happen. And when you see that team sheet and it's very different, it can set off an absolutely incredible drift. And there are opportunities up and down that fixture list. When you look at that list, you're going to see loads and loads of different matches, loads of interesting things going on. And you can't really rule anything out because opportunities pop out of the woodwork all over the place. This is why I like when we see these cup matches, and especially when there are lots of them, you're going to find some opportunities in there. And we had a significant mismatch in the third round of the FA Cup one year when Manchester City met Swindon. And of course, you know, Manchester City were a very dominant side in this particular season. Swindon weren't so much, with due respect to all of the Swindon fans out of there. And as a consequence, Manchester City were going to go off at incredibly short odds. But news began to leak out about how a number of players were going to be rested, and there was a lot of speculation about which players may or may not play. And as a consequence, the price started to drift. And you can see the price drifting and the sort of reaction that there was to that. But what actually happened on the day was when that team sheet came out, it was actually pretty strong. So we went from very short odds to much, much bigger odds. And then all of a sudden it crashed back in. So whichever way you wanted to catch this, you could have got a really, really good trade out of this particular market. So it's worth keeping your ears to the ground, keeping an eye on all of the news flow that's coming out of these teams, but also being actively aware of what's going on within those individual markets. Because whether it's a competitive, uncompetitive match, there's fixture congestion or there's not, there's usually a few stories to be told during these cup matches, especially in the third round of the FA Cup. It's a really great opportunity. So these opportunities can occur for a number of reasons, but the two sort of things you're primarily looking for are fixture congestion. That can occur at pretty much any time of the year, but it's more dominant when there are lots of cup matches in or European competition. But also injuries and also cup matches, because where you get this mismatch between teams, a lot of managers will decide whether they want to play a full strength team or not, or which competition is more important to them. And certainly when it comes to the FA Cup and the lower prize money that you see on the FA Cup, a lot of people will put their focus on to the Premier League. So the chance of a deep run in the FA Cup isn't particularly likely, and they're not going to earn much money. So why not focus on the most important competition where they are likely to earn money, where they need to put their focus. So you can see this occurring for a number of reasons. You have to be aware of exactly, what is likely. Is there press coming out to indicate what the team will be? And obviously you need to be aware of what would be a good or a bad team, but very often you can use social media to identify that. And if you look at the fan accounts or people responding to team sheet news, that will give you a good indicator as to whether it's a good team or not, or whether there are any surprises within there. Another little tip that I can share with you as well is we have a piece of automation on BetAngel that will actually monitor all of these matches for you and pick up on any increase in activity within that market, which will then flag to you exactly when something interesting is going on. You tend to find the market takes a while to adjust to these particular prices as the team news begins to roll out and as people begin to adjust positions. They may have backed a team at a certain price and then they look at the team sheet and think, right, I'm not having that. Or it may be people just waiting for that team sheet news to come out and then jumping on the opportunity to take their position at that particular moment in time. But whichever way you look at it, this is a great opportunity. It's relatively low risk because you're doing it before the match has even started. And it's something that you should really put your focus into, especially when we have FA Cup matches.